It's just past noon on September 21st, and Colonel Mikhail steps into his armored SUV outside a secure compound in Sevastopol. His driver already knows their destination, the Foros sanatorium, hidden in the shadows along Crimea's rugged coastline. But what neither know is that Ukrainian drones are already airborne, racing undetected towards that same location, and the clock is ticking. Mikhail checks his watch again, 7 p.m. He's irritated and tired, but he knows better than to skip these briefings. Foros isn't just some fancy resort. It's the spot where critical decisions about Russia's military plans are quietly made behind closed doors. In fact, between Foros and nearby Yalta, there are 4 state-owned dachas that Moscow's elite regularly use. 2 of them reportedly reserved just for President Vladimir Putin himself. Since Soviet times, high-ranking officials, intelligence operatives, and influential commanders have come here for secret meetings. Even Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was confined to his Foros dacha during the 1991 coup attempt, held hostage by hardliners until their plot collapsed. It's safe to say this area has always been one of Russia's top corridors of power. Tonight, Colonel Mikhail expects nothing different. Just another routine security meeting, discussing logistics and troop deployments. For a couple of days now, the main restaurant, Foros Hall, and certain areas of the resort have been closed to the public for a private event. Inside one of the complex's elegant buildings, Colonel Mikhail joined several generals and intelligence officials already gathered. Some of these men flew in from Moscow under extreme secrecy. Rumor has it that an especially important figure, maybe even a deputy minister or a high-ranking general, is attending tonight, which would explain the tightened security everywhere. The meeting begins, but none of them are aware that 90 minutes earlier, at around 5:30 p.m., a swarm of Ukrainian drones had already taken off, heading towards their exact location. Radar screens across Crimea start lighting up, tracking dozens of unidentified drones infiltrating Russian airspace along the front line, approximately 170 miles from the Foros facility. Somehow, Ukraine's intelligence agency, the SBU, found out about this secret gathering at the very last moment. They knew Russian commanders and top figures would be at Foros, but they lacked specifics, exactly which buildings, which rooms, which floors. Still, time was tight, and valuable opportunities like this one are rare. Ukrainian drone operators quickly prepared for the best attack they could manage with the limited time that they had. Their drone launch sites, hidden in fields across southern Ukraine, were roughly 285 kilometers from the coastal target. Operators ran final checks and launched the drones into the air at precisely timed intervals, making sure everything was perfectly calculated to achieve maximum surprise. First came 24 cheap FPV decoys, launched simultaneously and flying at around 100 kilometers per hour. Their entire purpose was just to distract and overwhelm Russia's sophisticated air defense systems stationed across the Crimean Peninsula. Just as expected, Russian radar screens flashed to life instantly. Operators panicked at the sheer number of threats. Pantsir air defense systems and Manpad's teams scrambled, desperately trying to intercept this sudden swarm. Over the next 30 minutes, all these decoy drones were successfully shot down. Russian crews began celebrating their apparent success. But what they didn't realize was that the real threat had slipped through unnoticed and was already closing in on the actual target. The hidden wave of second drones was traveling at nearly 150 kilometers per hour, covering the 285-kilometer flight in just under 2 hours. Controllers far away in mainland Ukraine skillfully guided them through valleys and along the coastal terrain, flying as low as possible to stay undetected until the very last moment. Russian defenders began to feel relieved, assuming they'd neutralized the attack. But just an hour later, their radar screens flashed again. This time the radar showed a smaller but faster incoming wave, not on the front line, but deep inside Crimean airspace. It was the Nebo-M, a high-tech mobile radar system strategically placed around Crimea that picked up these low-flying drones about 30 minutes from hitting their intended target. The Nebo-M radar system is one of Russia's most advanced early warning assets, specifically designed to detect stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, and low-altitude drones. With its powerful multi-band sensors operating simultaneously across UHF, VHF, and L-band frequencies, Nebo-M can track targets even at extremely low altitudes, making terrain-hugging drones and stealthy cruise missiles much less effective at evading detection. Yet, despite its impressive capabilities, the Russians now had a very short reaction window, only about 30 minutes. The drones were just 80 kilometers away. Radar operators frantically relayed target coordinates, directions, and altitudes over encrypted radio channels. Russian air defense teams, completely caught off guard by the sudden warning so deep inside their airspace, hurriedly repositioned their launchers, locked onto the incoming threats, and fired missiles towards the approaching drones. The Nebo-M radar itself can't shoot down targets. It's there to detect, track, and guide defenders to their objectives. With Nebo-M's help, the Russians managed to shoot down 3 of the 6 drones mid-flight. But the others slipped past and headed straight for Foros, aiming at buildings where Ukrainian intelligence guessed the guests would be. One drone was damaged at the very last minute, its debris crashing into the old Terletsky boarding school, a building just a few hundred meters from the sanatorium's guest house, destroying its assembly hall completely. Seconds later, another drone ripped through the roof of the Luciano Hotel on the resort grounds. The final drone was hit, crashing into the forested hills nearby. Still, the damage was already done. For the rest of the night, Russian forces remained on high alert. Several mobile radar units were quickly called in to reinforce the area further. But it was safe to say that every so-called important guest at Foros probably soiled themselves, getting a first-hand taste of what these soldiers faced on the daily in their brutal frontline fighting. For these Russian commanders, the war had finally become real. Not just something they discussed in closed-door briefings at a luxurious resort, but an immediate, terrifying reality that they could no longer ignore. By midnight, Sergei Aksyonov, the Moscow-installed head of occupied Crimea, posted a statement on his Telegram channel. He claimed that 3 people were killed and 16 were injured in the attack. Almost as soon as the news of the explosions started spreading, Russian state media and officials quickly labeled the Foros strike as a deliberate terrorist attack. The defense ministry announced, at 19:30 Moscow time, in the resort area of Crimea, where there is no military targets whatsoever, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a terrorist strike using drones armed with high-explosive warheads. But what Moscow's statements carefully avoided mentioning was the uncomfortable truth about that night. Sure, Foros was technically a resort, but it definitely wasn't just some random civilian building. Over the last decade, especially since the annexation in 2014, the Foros sanatorium had gradually become a de facto command center and high-level safe haven for Russian officials and military leadership. Moreover, an independent Crimean news channel called Crimean Wind had already reported that very important guests were visiting the sanatorium that evening. Even the resort's own social media accounts had announced earlier that day, September 21st, that its main restaurant was closed off for a private event. With heavy military presence and intensive security sweeps, it was pretty clear that senior figures, whether top military brass, security officials, or political operatives, were gathering at Foros that night. As the hours passed and the night got darker, Russian authorities found it increasingly difficult to control the public narrative. Instead, they tried pushing an emotional storyline, accusing Ukraine of deliberately hitting a boarding school complex nearby. But it didn't take long for the truth to leak out. It turned out the supposedly innocent boarding school complex hit by debris was actually owned by a Russian state bank and had previously been repurposed for government use at various points. Despite the Kremlin's claim of innocence, it's widely known that the Federal Security Services, the FSB, Russia's powerful intelligence agency, maintains a constant operational presence at Foros, closely monitoring and securing the premises. The entire resort has deep connections to the Russian state. Back in 2016, the resort was bought by the Federation of Trade Unions of Tatarstan, using financing from major Russian businesses, including the oil giant Taftneft. So it's not exactly a surprise that this place became a go-to spot for secretive, high-level gatherings. It's ironic, and maybe even a bit poetic, that Foros is making headlines again, more than 3 decades after the fall of the Soviet Union. Back in the 1980s and the early 1990s, Foros was known primarily as a secluded hideaway reserved for the Soviet elite, famed for its luxurious state dachas and peaceful coastal beauty. But in August of 1991, that tranquility was shattered when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev arrived at his lavish seaside villa, intending to rest and recover from escalating political troubles back in Moscow. Gorbachev's attempts at reform, perestroika, and glasnost had unintentionally ignited nationalist movements, economic crises, and deep divisions within the Soviet Union. By mid-1991, communist hardliners decided they had had enough. They believed Gorbachev's reforms were tearing the USSR apart, and resolved to stop him before the damage became irreversible. On the afternoon of August 18, 1991, Gorbachev suddenly found himself completely cut off from the outside world. His communications went silent, his phone lines were dead, and when he anxiously tried his emergency connections, nothing worked. He quickly realized he'd become a prisoner in his own luxurious retreat. Military units loyal to the coup leaders surrounded the villa, isolating Gorbachev from the rest of the country. The plotters, led by senior Communist Party and KGB officials, publicly announced that Gorbachev was seriously ill and couldn't perform his duties. They declared a state of emergency, trying desperately to regain control of the rapidly unraveling Soviet state. But their actions sparked the opposite of what they intended. Rather than preserving the Soviet Union, their actions actually pushed it closer to collapse. In Moscow, Russian President Boris Yeltsin famously climbed atop a tank outside of parliament, rallying thousands of protesters against the coup leaders. As the plotters began to realize how badly they'd miscalculated, their confidence started to fade. Within 3 days, their coup attempt collapsed spectacularly. On the evening of August 21st, Soviet security forces loyal to Yeltsin arrived by plane at Foros, finally restoring Gorbachev's communications and formally ending his captivity. But even though Gorbachev regained his freedom, the damage was done. Just 4 months later, the Soviet Union collapsed completely. Ukraine inherited Crimea, and along with it, several luxurious properties previously reserved for only the Soviet political elite. Now, initially, these lavish seaside retreats in Foros fell into neglect. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no centralized authority or funding to keep them maintained. Buildings began to crumble, gardens grew wild, and facilities became outdated and unusable. Even the famous Foros Dacha, the place where Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had been held prisoner, was left mostly abandoned, losing much of its historical significance as people struggled to survive and adjust in a new reality. After the USSR broke apart, Ukraine faced serious economic hardships. Factories closed, unemployment surged, and inflation spiraled out of control, wiping out people's savings almost overnight. Basic necessities became luxuries, as infrastructures deteriorated without government support. Ukrainians, like millions of others across Eastern Europe, struggled through a painful transition from a centrally planned economy to an uncertain, often chaotic, market-based system. But as Ukraine began to stabilize in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Foros slowly regained prominence. This time as a popular resort destination accessible to everyone, not just political insiders. It soon became a favorite summer destination for ordinary Ukrainians, Russians, and other Europeans, attracting thousands of visitors each year with its beautiful beaches, subtropical climate, and stunning coastal views. That's precisely why, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, Moscow found it more challenging than expected to retake complete control of these luxurious properties. Still, Foros eventually returned to its earlier role as a favored retreat for Russia's political and military elite. High-ranking officials once again began arriving at the lavish resort in heavily guarded motorcades, reclaiming what Moscow saw as rightfully theirs. And that's exactly why, now in 2025, Foros has turned into a battleground, a symbol of Ukraine's unwavering determination to reclaim its stolen territory. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that the war will not be over until Crimea returns to Ukrainian control, and Ukraine's actions clearly back up that determination. Starting in early 2022, Ukraine launched a series of daring attacks deep inside of Crimea. In April of that year, Ukrainian missiles famously sank the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. A few months later in August, mysterious explosions rocked Crimea's Saki airbase, destroying several Russian warplanes on the ground. At the time, these attacks felt almost unbelievable. Crimea had always seemed well behind enemy lines, untouchable and safe from Ukrainian retaliation. But still, from that point onward, things have only gotten worse for the Russian forces in Crimea. By late 2023, even some of Russia's most advanced defenses started showing serious vulnerabilities. For example, in August of 2023, a Ukrainian-modified Neptune missile successfully destroyed a modern S-400 air defense battery near Cape Tarkhankut on Crimea's western coast. The S-400 system was one of Russia's proudest and most sophisticated surface-to-air missile setups, specifically designed to protect Crimea from exactly the kinds of strikes Ukraine was now carrying out. Losing that S-400 battery revealed just how weak Russia's supposed air defense shield over Crimea really was. And it wasn't the only one. Another S-400 site near Yevpatoria was hit just a few weeks later, reportedly after Ukrainian drones first disabled its radar systems, allowing a missile to finish the job. Then, the very next month, in late September of 2023, Ukraine carried out one of its boldest attacks yet. A barrage of British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles struck the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, in broad daylight, right in the middle of a senior naval commander's meeting. The missile strike blew a massive hole right through the historic naval building. Kyiv claimed they'd eliminated dozens of high-ranking naval officers, possibly including the fleet's commander himself. Moscow tried to downplay the damage and the casualties, but they couldn't hide the burning wreckage and the destruction of their naval HQ. The pressure on the Black Sea Fleet got so intense that Russia eventually had no choice but to make a strategic retreat. Throughout the rest of 2023, and especially after that devastating headquarters strike, Russia relocated many of its remaining warships and submarines from their main base in Sevastopol back to ports on the Russian mainland. By early 2024, Ukraine had managed to either sink or seriously damage roughly one-third of the Black Sea Fleet's active vessels. British defense intelligence even went as far as calling the Russian fleet functionally inactive. At the same time, Ukraine continued to hit critical infrastructure that connected Crimea directly to Russia. The Kerch Strait Bridge, Putin's prized $4 billion project, and the only direct road and rail link from Russia to Crimea, had suffered several spectacular attacks. Back in October of 2022, a massive truck bomb exploded, taking out one of its spans. Then in July of 2023, Ukrainian drones struck it again, killing 2 civilians and disrupting crucial road traffic for weeks. Each time this bridge was hit, videos of the damaged structure quickly spread online, seriously undermining Russia's narrative of having full control over Crimea. After the July attack, Russian tourists who had been casually enjoying beach vacations suddenly panicked and decided it was time to leave Crimea immediately. Massive traffic jams stretched for kilometers, clogging roads as visitors and even some residents rushed to escape via the only other route available, the land corridor through Russian-occupied southern Ukraine. But even that route wasn't safe anymore. Ukrainian forces had struck the Konhar Bridge a month earlier, temporarily knocking out one of the key highways leading from mainland Ukraine into the peninsula. By this point, it was crystal clear that Ukraine could effectively cut Crimea off from Russia whenever it chose. For ordinary Russians in Crimea, whether they were tourists or among the hundreds of thousands who moved there after 2014 under Russian occupation, life had become stressful and uncertain. After the Kerch Bridge explosions, many tourists canceled their trips completely. Who would want to spend a summer holiday listening to explosions in the distance and constantly worrying that the route home could collapse into the sea? Meanwhile, life became especially hard for the roughly 2.4 million Ukrainian citizens still living in Crimea, including ethnic Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and even some Russians who opposed Moscow's takeover. In the early days after 2014, things might have seemed somewhat normal. But gradually, the Russian authorities cracked down harder and harder. Ukrainian language schools were shut down, Ukrainian media outlets were banned, and anyone who spoke out against the occupation faced threats, arrests, or sudden disappearances. Public gatherings became nearly impossible. Ukrainian symbols and flags were banned, and fear became a part of everyday life. But despite Russia's relentless pressure, a determined underground resistance began forming across Crimea. Ordinary residents, teachers, shopkeepers, students, and everyday workers began organizing and risking everything to fight back in subtle yet powerful ways. They formed secret networks to share intelligence about Russian troop movements, locations of critical military equipment, and details about upcoming events. Using encrypted apps and coded messages, they carefully sent critical targeting information back to Ukrainian forces on the mainland, allowing Kyiv to carry out precise missile strikes and drone attacks. It's very likely that intelligence about the secretive private event at the Foros retreat was transmitted through these same underground channels. One of the most active and influential resistance groups in Crimea goes by the name Atesh, which means fire in the Crimean Tatar language. Atesh quickly grew into a highly organized and bold underground movement, carrying out daring sabotage operations deep behind Russian lines. The group included Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, and even ethnic Russians opposed to Putin's regime. Atesh's members regularly sabotaged railway tracks used by the Russian army, placing carefully timed explosives that derailed trains carrying ammunition, fuel, and weaponry. They've also successfully attacked electrical substations, cutting power temporarily to Russian military bases and radar sites. Each of these sabotage acts is carefully coordinated with Ukraine's military intelligence, ensuring maximum disruption to Russian forces. After every successful operation, Atesh typically sends out anonymous messages online, boldly claiming responsibility and reminding everyone that Russia might occupy Crimea, but it can't truly control it. Atesh consistently provides detailed, real-time intelligence to Kyiv, everything from where Russian troops gather to the exact hiding spots of critical air defense systems and locations where senior Russian officials might be meeting. This crucial information has allowed Ukraine to launch precise drone and missile attacks, operations that wouldn't have been possible without the extraordinary courage of these Crimean partisans on the ground. After the drone strike on Foros, Russian authorities found themselves living in constant anxiety. If Ukraine's intelligence was sharp enough to pinpoint a secret meeting of VIP guests at Foros and hit it so directly, what might they target next? Perhaps a high-profile leader in Crimea, such as Sergei Aksyonov himself or top military officials, could be in Kyiv's crosshairs next time. By weakening Russia's morale and military strength in Crimea, Ukraine is setting the stage for an eventual return, either through a full military offensive or a Russian collapse. For ordinary Crimeans who heard the distant explosions that night from miles away, felt a renewed sense of uncertainty and unease. The Foros strike was a powerful reminder of how fragile their day-to-day security had become. Back in the Kremlin, President Putin reportedly received detailed briefings about the Foros incident immediately. One can only imagine his frustration upon learning that his cherished private refuge, a place where he himself had vacationed multiple times under tight security, had now been violated by a direct Ukrainian strike. Crimea was the first piece of Ukraine that Russia tore away, and it will also be the final piece that Ukraine recovers to achieve a comprehensive victory. Ukrainian leaders have repeatedly assured their people that they will return, that someday soon, the Ukrainian flag will fly again in Simferopol, in Yalta, and yes, in Foros too. Thanks for watching.